1. All white people are invested in and collude with racism. 2. White supremacy describes the culture we live in, a culture that positions white people and all that is associated with them, whiteness, as ideal. And 3. White people raised in Western society are conditioned into a white supremacist worldview because it is the bedrock of our society and its institutions. Now, what do all three of those phrases have in common? First, I don't believe any of them. So if you're a regular watcher of this channel, and there are very few of you, don't worry. I haven't gone super crazy woke. But 2, and more importantly, they can all be found in this book, White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And as you might have guessed, that is what this video is about. I want to go through this book and provide quotes showing exactly how ridiculous and how much generalization there is in this book. To give a little bit of background, the book that we're looking at today is White Fragility, subtitled Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, and it was written by Robin DiAngelo. In her book, she gave what I thought was the best description of what she actually does for a living. So she said that occasionally people say the following: "How dare you suggest that I could have said or done something racist?" And her response? "Although these are unpleasant moments for me, they are also rather amusing. The reason I am there in the first place is because I have been hired specifically to do just that." Her job is essentially to go into businesses who hire her and tell their employees exactly why they're racist. Because make no mistake, they are racist. If you're white, you are racist, according to Robin DiAngelo. And we'll see that in just a little bit. The reason I'm talking about this is that for some reason, it's a very popular book. It's a #1 New York Times bestseller, and it's been on the Amazon best-selling chart for 7 weeks in a row. So apparently people actually like this book for some reason. To give you another idea of the things we're going to be looking at so you actually stick around to the end, consider this. In the book, she directly quotes Ibram Kendi, and then a little bit later she starts paraphrasing him. He is the author of this book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. But this is what she says specifically in her book. Kendi goes on to argue that if we truly believe that all humans are equal, then disparity in condition can only be the result of systemic discrimination. Let me paraphrase her paraphrase. Essentially, that is saying that any inequality in outcome must be the result of systemic discrimination. That's obviously not the case, but it's the claim being made here. Now, disparity in condition can mean a lot of different things, for sure. It can be a disparity in income, or a disparity in where you live, or a disparity in the schools you can go to, many different things. But for simplicity's sake, let's just consider disparity in income, because that kind of encompasses a lot of other disparities. Now, before you say to me, well, she didn't actually say that, she was just paraphrasing someone. That is true, but why would she include it in the book if she didn't agree with it? And if you're still not convinced, consider this quote. She provides a list saying that whites enact racism while maintaining a positive self-image in many ways. And one of those things? Attributing inequality between whites and people of color to causes other than racism. So she is saying that if you believe the inequality is not necessarily because of racism, that's just you being a racist. So to put all of this together, if we truly believe in equality, that means we must have equality of outcome. Disregard the fact that human beings being equal does not mean we're equally talented, equally skilled, equally smart, nothing like that. I will never achieve the level of success that someone like Michael Jordan has. And that doesn't mean I'm being discriminated against. For example, did you know that firstborn children actually tend to earn more than their siblings? We see here that firstborn kids are the most likely to earn 6 figures and hold a top executive position. Does that mean that there's some sort of systemic discrimination against second and thirdborn children? Obviously, that is not the case. In addition, I probably don't have to point out that Asian Americans earn more than any other race on average. Does that mean somehow that white people are discriminated against with respect to Asian Americans? Of course not. There are a multitude of reasons why there are disparities in conditions and incomes. You cannot say it must be racism unless you account for the other factors. But we just saw, we can't even try to account for those things because DiAngelo says if you do, it's racist. Trying to say that disparities are not necessarily a result of racism, trying to account for other possibilities, that in itself is racist. Now, we've gotten this far, but haven't yet talked about what white fragility actually means. She says that white fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include outward display of emotions such as fear and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. Now, it may not seem like it at first, but this is a fairly clever definition. You see, it's a self-proving hypothesis. What this means is that if you agree with her that white fragility is an issue, then you agree with her and presumably you will agree with her other policies. However, if you disagree and you try to prove that it's not a thing, then she could just say you're being argumentative and thus you're proving white fragility. So in denying its existence, you are verifying its existence. As you may be able to guess from the title, she's actually trying to talk to white people and explain racism to them. So the audience of this book is white people, but not just every white people, specifically white progressives. Because in her view, I believe the white progressives cause the most daily damage to people of color. So at that point, if you're a conservative or a libertarian or just not a progressive, maybe you think that you're fine, that you're not the issue and you don't have to worry about it. But you'd be wrong, because at least in DiAngelo's eyes, you are probably a progressive. Because in her opinion, a progressive is any white person who thinks he or she is not racist, or is less racist, or in the choir, or already gets it. And that encompasses virtually every white person in the United States. I don't know very many white people who say, yeah, I am a racist, so what? That's not really a thing. So according to her, if you're a conservative but you think you're not racist, you're actually a white progressive somehow. I don't understand that. But it just goes to show how they take definitions and then twist it so they can say very ridiculous and generalized claims. And the best example of that is racism. You may already be aware, but there's a push by many on the left, DiAngelo included, to try and redefine the term racism. Now, if you think that racism is something like discrimination or prejudice based on the basis of race, that's a pretty good definition, but they would disagree with it. Let's see what she has to say. To understand racism, we need to first distinguish it from mere prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is prejudgment about another person based on the social groups to which that person belongs, and discrimination is action based on prejudice. So far, I have no problems with those definitions. Discrimination and prejudice, that seemed fairly clear. But here is where it gets a little bit off track. When a racial group collective prejudice is backed by the power of legal authority and institutional control, it is transformed into racism. And in case that wasn't quite clear enough, here's another one. Similarly, racism, like sexism and other forms of oppression, occurs when a racial group's prejudice is backed by legal authority and institutional control. DiAngelo appears to be one of the people who says that racism must be prejudice or discrimination plus power. Without that power, without the institutional control, you cannot be a racist. And the reason for this switch is so they can say absurd things like people of color cannot be racist. And yes, she says that. People of color may also hold prejudices and discriminate against white people, but they lack the social and institutional power that transform their prejudice and discrimination into racism. She continues, as with prejudice and discrimination, we can remove the qualifier reverse from any discussion of racism. You see, because only white people can be racist. Even if a black person does something that would seem to be racist, it's actually not. In the US and other white settler nations, only white people are in the positions to oppress people of color collectively and throughout the whole of society. While a white person may have been picked on, even mercilessly, by being in the numerical minority in a specific context, the individual was experiencing race prejudice and discrimination, not racism. No matter how racist an act was against a white person, if it was done by a minority, it could not have been racist in DiAngelo's eyes. It was race prejudice or race discrimination, but not racism. And this is an issue I have by and large with those who are anti-racist. They are redefining the term racism so you can say black people cannot be racist, but also all white people are invested in and collude with racism. And that's because racism is not an individual act. To be racist, you must be the race that has more institutional power or control. And if you are, you're automatically a racist because you're part of the system. That's why she can say all white people collude with racism, but it's impossible for any black person or minority to be a racist. Let me give you one clear example on why that is a ridiculous definition. Take David Duke. He is a former leader of the KKK. No one would argue that he is not racist. I doubt even he would argue against that because he was in the KKK and it's kind of what they're known for. So we can all agree he's racist. However, based on this definition, he can only be racist if his race has institutional power or control. So if you were to take him and place him somewhere in Africa, let's say Algeria, he would no longer be racist based on this definition because he would be the minority in that country. And that means since he's the minority, he would not have the institutional control and thus he couldn't be racist. Now, I would argue that if you take someone like David Duke and you put him in a large minority context, he would become more racist, not less, because he wouldn't like where he is. But based on how she defines racism, that is not the case. And for me, if your definition of racism is so loose that by merely changing the geographical location of someone, you can determine whether they're racist or not, it's a bad definition. Racism should not be an external thing, it's an internal thing. Now, we've heard a lot about institutional control and power, so what exactly does she mean by that? Well, she gives one example, and it's a really bad one. She says, "A person of color may refuse to wait on me if I enter a shop, but people of color cannot pass legislation that prohibits me, and everyone like me, from buying a home in a certain neighborhood." Just to be clear, her example of white people having control and power over black people is redlining, which certainly was an issue, I won't deny that, but it is no longer legal, so why did she choose that? From the Washington Post, until 1968, landlords could legally refuse to rent to African Americans and other people of color, and homeowners and real estate agents could refuse to show or sell them homes. However, the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968 declared these practices illegal. So her example to prove that white people have institutional power and control and are racist is that they could, 50 years ago, deny black people a certain home in a certain neighborhood. Where exactly is the institutional control that white people have in this example? It doesn't exist. So why would she choose that in the first place? I don't understand. But maybe I don't understand all of these new definitions and this example because, unlike Ruth Frankenberg, I am not a premier white scholar in the field of whiteness studies. What kind of job description is that? A premier white scholar in the field of whiteness studies? That's a lot of white. Just to give you a few more quotes about racism and how it's basically everywhere in the United States, racism is the norm, not the aberration. Which I would agree with if she were talking about all of human history. Because for most of human history, racism has been the norm. But in the United States of America, I would argue it is not. That we are in fact the aberration in that we're largely non-racist. She quoted this filmmaker, who I'm not going to try to say the name. "Racism is a systemic, societal, institutional, omnipresent, and epistemologically embedded phenomenon that pervades every vestige of our reality. Racism is everywhere, it's everything, and it's everyone." But it's not just racism that's everywhere. There are a lot of other ideals that we hold in the United States that apparently are a negative thing. The system of racism begins with ideology, which refers to the big ideas that are reinforced throughout society. From birth, we are conditioned into accepting and not questioning these ideas. Examples of ideology in the United States include individualism, the superiority of capitalism as an economic system, and democracy as a political system, consumerism as a desirable lifestyle, and meritocracy, which is the belief that anyone can succeed if he or she works hard. So here she gives a list of examples of things that we're taught in our youth, which are things that I would generally agree with. We're taught individualism, capitalism, democracy. These are, by and large, positive things. But here, and in several instances throughout the book, she refers to meritocracy and individualism as these negative aspects. That if you truly believe that you can work hard and succeed, somehow that's a negative thing. Or that individualism, that everyone is an individual and that we have individual worth, individual life experiences, that's also a negative because in her view, it gets rid of race entirely. If you've made it this far into the video, that's awesome. You've gone 13 minutes. Hopefully it's been enlightening and you've learned something. If you haven't, I apologize. I'm not going to give you a refund on those 13 minutes. You wasted them. But if you did appreciate it, leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel so we can see future videos like this. But perhaps more importantly, share it. This book, White Fragility, is being talked about in a lot of different areas right now. And it's really important that we recognize how bad a book it actually is. So if you agree with some of the points I've brought up so far, be sure to share it on Facebook, Twitter, whatever social media you may have. And if you have someone talk about how great this book is, as I've seen many times, you can direct them to this video. And hopefully I can show them why they're wrong and it's not a great book. Another term that DiAngelo distorts in her book is white supremacy. White supremacy is a descriptive and useful term to capture the all-encompassing centrality and assumed superiority of people defined and perceived as white and the practices based on this assumption. Doesn't sound bad so far, but let's keep going. White supremacy in this context does not refer to individual white people and their individual intentions or actions, but to an overarching political, economic, and social system of domination. Once again, white supremacy is not really an individual thing or an internal thing, it's more an external thing. White supremacy describes the culture we live in, a culture that positions white people and all that is associated with them as ideal. White people raised in Western society are conditioned into a white supremacist worldview because it is the bedrock of our society and its institutions. So what she's doing here is taking white supremacy and applying it to everyone who is white in the United States and to virtually every system in the United States as well. After all, it's in the bedrock of our society. By those definitions, most other white majority countries would also be white supremacists. However, the United States is still inherently bad even among the other white supremacist cultures. While racism and other cultures exist, the United States is a global power, and through movies and mass media, white supremacy is circulated globally. So it's not enough to say that the United States is a white supremacist nation. We spread our white supremacist ideals all across the globe. And to kind of round this out, we live in a culture that circulates relentless messages of white superiority. These exist simultaneously with relentless messages of black inferiority, which, I disagree with, but that doesn't really matter because she is the scholar here. She's really the only one who knows how we really are all deeply white supremacists. So she says, and would like every other white person to also say, I was socialized as white in a racism-based society. I have a racist worldview, deep racial bias, racist patterns, and investments in the racist system that has elevated me. To which I say, it seems like you have the racist problem, not me, so stop trying to say that I'm racist and just deal with it on your own. But that's the problem here. She's basically saying, if I, who am very, very woke, admit that I am racist, then all of you non-woke white people also are racist. Even more so, as a matter of fact. And she gives a few examples trying to prove her point, but they're really weird. There is a curious satisfaction in the punishment of black people, the smiling faces of the white crowd picnicking at lynchings in the past, and the satisfied approval of white people observing mass incarceration and execution in the present. White righteousness when inflicting pain on African Americans is evident. In the glee, the white collective derives from blackface and depictions of black as apes and gorillas. What are you even saying here? White people are happy when black people are injured or killed? When they're executed? Again, she's looking at things that happened 60, 70 years ago with lynchings, and that was certainly an issue, and then trying to say the same thing happens today, but in a different way. And that's completely absurd. What type of glee do we as white people get in seeing blackface? Honestly, let me know. Because as far as I was aware, blackface is a huge social taboo. There are people who have lost their jobs for doing these things, and yet somehow white people are apparently just gleeful when this happens. I don't understand that. She continues in this vein with anti-blackness. Anti-blackness comes from deep guilt about what we have done and continue to do. The unbearable knowledge of our complicity with the profound torture of black people from past to present. Once again, she takes something from the past, just like lynching, redlining, and pretends that it still happens today in a different way. But that's not the case. But what exactly is the profound torture that's happening to black Americans today? Like seriously, what is it? To say that black people are being profoundly tortured in 2020 is a bit of an extreme. As an example of anti-blackness, she points to The Blind Side. This movie, which is based on a true story, chronicles Michael Oher and how he grew up as a young black man in a very poor area, was adopted by a white family, which I think you pronounce the Towies, I'm not entirely sure what their family is called, and then he eventually ends up being a professional football player and doing very well for himself. Robin DiAngelo doesn't like it. She says, the Towies of course are the good whites. The film is fundamentally and insidiously anti-black. So what examples does she provide in this movie to show it's anti-black? Many problematic racial narratives are reinscribed in the film. Oher himself is portrayed as a childlike giant who lives in abject poverty. Sprinkled in are his drug-addicted single mother with multiple children from unknown fathers, the incompetent welfare worker, the uppity lawyer, and the menacing gang members in his drug-infested and crime-ridden neighborhood. I haven't seen this movie in a very long time, so I'm not entirely sure if the way she's describing the film is accurate. I know the basic idea of what happens, but I don't know the specifics like she's saying. So let me just say we're going to take her word for it and say that all of this is true and portrayed as such in the film. If we can prove that those things were incorrect and didn't actually happen, then sure, I'd agree with her. The problem is, most of it actually is true. But who cares about a little thing called truth when you're trying to fight what you think is institutional racism in our culture? For example, Michael Oher's mother suffered from alcohol and drug addictions, and she was unable to give him and his 11 siblings the attention and care they needed growing up. His father was frequently in prison where he was eventually murdered. One, he did have a drug-addicted mother, so that part was true. He had plenty of siblings. They were all from one father, but the father was never around. It was the ghettos of Memphis, Tennessee, where he lived and shared similar stories with many others who had experienced a broken home, lived around drug use and crime, and struggled to survive the troubles of poverty. Michael would be locked out of his home while his mother was inside doing drugs with her friends. Michael moved from foster home to foster home and even remained homeless at times. So the depiction of Michael Oher's childhood is actually fairly accurate. Yes, he had a drug-addicted mother. Yes, he grew up in poverty. Yes, he grew up in a drug-ridden area. All of this is true, but it's an example of anti-blackness because it shouldn't have been portrayed in the film. DiAngelo's take is similar to AOC, is that even if it were factually correct, we need to think about if it's morally right. And I guess since it's not, it should not have been portrayed in the movie. Once again, even though that was his life, you're trying to erase his life experiences, which I thought was something that people like DiAngelo didn't do. But believe it or not, it gets worse, because she then starts going after the family who adopted him in real life. The film ends with a voiceover from Miss Toei, a Christian, claiming it was God's will that this boy be saved. This is the part that really gets me. Presumably because his talent on the field made him more profitable, and thus valuable to white people. This is absurd. She's saying basically the only reason that he was ever adopted was because they found out he was good at football. If he didn't have any skill and if he wasn't profitable or valuable for white people, I guess they never would have adopted him? I hesitate to call this evil, but I don't know what else to say here. She is accusing the Toeys, who adopted a child out of their own free will, of only doing so because they saw some profit in it. This is disgusting. If nothing else, this shows that she is not a moral leader, even though that's basically how she's trying to portray herself in this book. We also probably shouldn't take her or the book seriously if she believes these kind of things. But let's look at another example of anti-blackness. So she tells a story of a friend who was telling her about her friends who were moving to New Orleans, and this is what she said. She was telling me about a white couple she knew who had just moved to New Orleans. Of course, she immediately added, they also had to buy a gun, and Joan is afraid to leave the house. I immediately knew that they had bought a home in a black neighborhood. Through this tale, the four of us fortified familiar images of the horror of black space and drew boundaries between us and them, without ever having to directly name race or openly express our disdain for black space. So a friend comes up and tells her about another friend who was moving to New Orleans but didn't feel very safe in the area. And her immediate response is to recognize how racist her friend is. First off, you're not a very good friend. But she's also completely disregarding the fact and doesn't mention that New Orleans is one of the most dangerous cities in the country. It's only safer than 2% of US cities, meaning it's more dangerous than 98% of them. And CBS News ranked it as the 16th most dangerous city in America. So it is in fact a dangerous city. But just mentioning that is racist. Readers may be asking themselves, but if the neighborhood is really dangerous, why is acknowledging this danger a sign of racism? Research into implicit bias has shown that perceptions of criminal activity are influenced by race. White people will perceive danger simply by the presence of black people. We cannot trust our perceptions when it comes to race and crime. So let's just ignore the fact that it is objectively speaking one of the most dangerous cities in the United States and that it has more crime than virtually any other city in the United States as well. None of that matters because we as white people cannot be trusted with our perception on crime. Even though I'm right now looking at these crime statistics, that's just me perceiving something where it's not actually there. Just like the blindside example, the truth here is irrelevant because it doesn't fit her belief or her narrative, which is actually a fairly common thread throughout this book. If a city is in a high crime area, but it also happens to have a fairly large black population, that does not mean you pointing out that it's a dangerous city is somehow racist. She also dedicates an entire chapter to white women's tears, so that we know they're inherently bad and triggering to people of color. White women's tears in cross-racial interactions are problematic for several reasons, connected to how they impact others. For example, there is a long historical backdrop of black men being tortured and murdered because of a white woman's distress, and we white women bring these histories with us. I know I've mentioned this already several times, but it's a pattern that keeps coming up. She takes something that certainly was an issue in the past, and then she pretends that it's happening in a different way today. It's certainly true that in the past, white women's tears resulted in black men especially being killed, beaten, lynched, imprisoned, all these horrific things. That is basically the entire plot of To Kill a Mockingbird. But that no longer happens today. And yet she says that white women bring these histories with them, and so they're inherently bad for that reason. And as always, she chooses a very poor example to try and illustrate her point. And it shows more about her own bias than about the white women's tears. In this instance, there's a white woman who began working at a social justice organization, and she was trained by several women of color. Eventually, that white woman got a promotion over those women of color, which is inherently bad, as we'll see. When the promotion was announced, the white woman tearfully requested support from the women of color, who had worked there for years and trained her. The new supervisor probably saw her tears as an expression of humility about the limits of her racial knowledge and expected support to follow. The women of color had to deal with the injustice of the promotion, the invalidation of their abilities, and the lack of racial awareness. Presumably, this white woman was very happy about getting a promotion, so they may have just been tears of joy. But even that is triggering, because apparently it invalidated the abilities of the women of color who did not get the promotion. We know nothing else about this story, and yet she can say with certainty that there was an injustice done to these women of color because they were not promoted, just because they'd been there longer. How long you've been at an organization does not determine by itself the promotions that you get. It's entirely possible that this white woman worked harder, longer hours, had better abilities than these women of color. We don't really know, but DiAngelo is implying very heavily that the only reason the white woman got the job was because of her race, which is a very racist thing to say, to be honest. But remember, you can't be racist against white people, so it's fine. At another point, DiAngelo asked a woman of color why white women's tears are so triggering. This was the response. "We are abused daily, beaten, raped, and killed, but you are so sad, and that's what's important. That's why it's so hard to take." And I did check to get the right amount of O's in that "so," just in case you were wondering. Once again, an exaggeration. If you really think that the experience of all black people in 2020 is that daily they are beaten, raped, and killed, then sure, you should fight back against the system because it's an evil system. But that's not happening. Statistically speaking, it's just not. Part of the reason, perhaps, that white women's tears are so negative in DiAngelo's eyes is because whiteness itself is a negative thing. Whiteness rests upon a foundational premise: the definition of whites as the norm or standard for human, and people of color as a deviation. And because of that, a positive white identity is an impossible goal. White identity is inherently racist. White people do not exist outside the system of white supremacy. And so DiAngelo's goal in life is to be less white, because to be less white is to be less racially oppressive. So there you have it. It's not just that all white people are racist and white supremacists. Whiteness itself is a negative thing. It's impossible to have a positive white identity because white identity is just racism. That's what she says here. But again, if I take umbrage with this in any way, I'm just proving her point about white fragility. That white people are fragile because if you say that they're all racist, they get upset. Who could have figured that? To show why we need to be less white and more woke, she has another example. She talks about university professors who'd said something in a classroom setting that they did not think was offensive. However, one of the students was offended by it, and so she was called by the university to come in and tell the professors essentially why they were racist and why what they said was wrong. And she says the professors essentially ignored the students' feelings because they didn't mean any harm. They were unable to separate intentions from impact. And by emphasizing intentions over impact, this guideline privileges the intentions of the aggressor over the impact of the behavior on the target. In doing so, the aggressor's intentions become the most important issue. She's essentially saying that if you are offended by something, then your impact takes precedence over the intention, which is the exact opposite of what it says in Coddling of the American Mind, which is a great book, and unlike this one, I would actually suggest that you read it. In that book, they define a word called safetyism. Safetyism refers to a culture or belief system in which safety has become a sacred value, which means that people become unwilling to make trade-offs demanded by other practical and moral concerns. Safety trumps everything else, no matter how unlikely or trivial the potential danger. Meaning that if you are offended by something, if you are microaggressed against, you then feel inherently unsafe. And because you are unsafe, action needs to be taken against the individual who harmed you, even though you weren't physically harmed in any way. You were just offended because they said something. Now, I'm not saying that you should go out of your way to be offensive. I'm also not discounting verbal and emotional abuse. But just because you are offended by something or there was an impact on you does not mean that you have been physically harmed or that you have been wronged in any way. This book has a plethora of examples of this exact idea of safetyism occurring on college campuses and the negative impacts that it has. Whether it be showing up to a teacher's home and harassing them because of something they said in an email, or physically taking over and occupying the entire administration building and effectively holding the president of the university hostage, these are things that have happened because students were offended and so they felt that they were wronged in some way. I could go through more examples, but just read the book, it'll make a lot more sense to you. I can, however, sum up all of this in one line. Looking at a speech code policy at Jackson State University, it once said, "No student shall offend anyone on university campus." Offense happens. We shouldn't look for it, but it's going to be there. If I look at a girl and I say hi, she might think I'm trying to hit on her and she could be offended. Does then that mean she can take action against me because she interpreted something that wasn't there? Of course not. That's absurd. People are going to be offended. But by valuing impact over intention, you're saying that if you feel offended, then you are morally in the right, and whoever did the offense, even if they didn't mean anything by it, is morally in the wrong. That's why things like microaggression is such a dangerous term. You're not being physically harmed in any way, but the term aggression is there to imply that you are. It's not just on college campuses where this is an issue anymore. It's trickled into the real world. Consider this op-ed written by Tom Cotton for the New York Times, in which he argued that we should perhaps send in federal troops to help squash the riots and the protests that were occurring. Now, you can agree with that, you can disagree with that, you can point out that he has errors, I don't really care, and that's fine. But if you overreact and somehow pretend that this is an attack against an individual, that's where you've gone too far. And that's exactly what New York Times employees did. Dozens of them tweeted out this: "Running this puts black New York Times staff in danger. This is the epitome of safetyism." Something was said that they disagreed with, and so they claim harm and potential danger. It's just a freaking op-ed. Get over it. And this leads to the belief that we need to have hate speech laws in America, because apparently hate speech and microaggressions, they're all forms of violence. However, we've also seen more recently that silence is also violence. So that means if you say something wrong, you're being violent. If you don't say anything at all, you're being violent. So basically, they've painted themselves into this tiny little box, that if you're in that box, you can speak. But if you're outside that box, you can only say the things that they tell you to say. And that's why you need to have a moral leader, someone like Robin DiAngelo, who can tell you the things you're allowed to say. What you can say is that all white people are racists and white supremacists. What you can't say is that you should treat people as individuals, because that's racist. To kind of emphasize how impact is more important than intention, DiAngelo shares a story where she's saying that she's essentially the bad guy. So she's taking a survey, and it's a very long, stupid, tedious survey. I'm sure we've all felt that before. It seems to never end, and the questions are pointless. She reacted as follows: "I find the questions tedious and feel irritated by them." Which is a valid response if in fact they were tedious, it was overly long, and if it was a stupid survey. However, what she didn't know at the time was that the survey was created by a woman of color, and so she should not have criticized the survey. This is how the creator of that survey responded: "I wrote that survey, and I have spent my life justifying my intelligence to white people." And this is how DiAngelo feels: "My chest constricts as I immediately realize the impact of my glib dismissal of the survey. I acknowledge this impact and apologize." If you felt it was a tedious and overly long survey, stick with your opinion. Just because it was written by someone who was black does not mean the survey somehow gets magic. I'm sorry that she feels that white people have continually dismissed her and judged her intelligence, but that does not change the fact that the survey, if it sucked, actually did suck. You don't have to change your opinion just because it was written by someone who was black. But because she was black and she was impacted by your comment, that must mean you were in the wrong. Even Robin DiAngelo, who was so much better than the normal white people because she recognizes she's a racist and a white supremacist, even she has issues and makes mistakes. So if she makes mistakes like this, mine must be even worse. We're getting a little bit close to the end, so I want to go through these fairly quickly. She quotes a sociologist as having said, "Because the new racial climate in America forbids the open expression of racially based feelings, views, and positions, when whites discuss issues that make them uncomfortable, they become almost incomprehensible." This is another way of looking at white fragility. But what do they mean that America forbids the open expression of racially based feelings, views, and positions? Maybe we're living in a different America, but in my America, when I tried to get White Fragility from the library, it was on hold 64 times. And so when I tried to get a version on Kindle, there were 24 copies, each of which had 20 holds on them, for a waiting time of more than 6 months. Need I point out once again that this book is a New York Times bestseller, as is How to Be an Anti-Racist. It doesn't really seem to me that America is forbidding the talking about race when you have a best-selling book that talks about race. What is she talking about? Claiming that the past was socially better than the present is also a hallmark of white supremacy. The romanticized traditional family values of the past are also racially problematic. This idealization of the past is another example of white experiences and perceptions positioned as universal. How might this nostalgia sound to any person of color who is aware of this country's history? The ability to erase this racial history and actually believe that the past was better than the present for everybody has inculcated a false consciousness for me personally and as a national citizen. Yep, that's right. She's even trying to ruin nostalgia for you. If you look back on the past with fondness, that's because you're being racist. You can't point out the fact that 50 years ago, the marriage rate in the United States was significantly higher, and births to unwed mothers was significantly lower. Things which, objectively speaking, are positive things for society and traditional family values, as she calls them. But if you point that out, you're ignoring the racial history of the United States. Looking back on the past with nostalgia is not saying that it was better in every aspect for every person. It's just saying, I miss this one thing about the past. Looking back when I could go to 7-Eleven and get a Jolly Rancher for a nickel is not saying that everything else when I was 10 was a lot better. That's not the case. But no, looking back fondly on the past is also racist. If you are white and you get accused of racism, don't you dare think about talking to one of your black or minority friends. How could you consider such a thing? By complaining to one person of color about the unfairness of feedback from another person of color, no matter how diplomatically or indirectly I try to mask my complaint, I am pressuring a person of color to collude with my racism. If a person of color calls me racist, then they are correct. I must be a racist. I can't go to anyone else and get their opinion because that's just asking them to collude with my racism. Speaking of which, if I do have a really good relationship with a black or minority person, there is still racism there. Racism cannot be absent from your friendship. No cross-racial relationship is free from the dynamics of racism in this society. Even if you're married to a person of color, you're still racist and there's still racism there. I believe that the white collective fundamentally hates blackness for what it reminds us of, that we are capable and guilty of perpetuating immeasurable harms and that our gains come through the subjugation of others. So I guess that if I gain anything in life, it's just through subjugation of others? But what if someone does literally point a finger and boldly say, "You're a racist"? It's still on me to identify my racist patterns and work to change them. Like I said, if someone calls you a racist, even if you didn't do anything racist or you're not a racist, you actually are a racist. That they're correct and you need to analyze why you're a racist. And one great way to analyze your racism is to read this book. How coincidental. In some ways, racism's adaptations over time are more sinister than concrete rules such as Jim Crow. The adaptations produce the same outcomes. People of color are blocked from moving forward. We can all agree that slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, it was all bad. But now we have things that are somehow more sinister than even Jim Crow. Because it has the same outcome. Black people are not allowed to move forward. Ignore the fact that under Jim Crow, you couldn't really have a black elected official. And we recently, raised in a culture of white supremacy, I exude a deeply internalized assumption of racial superiority. White supremacy, I guess, is kind of like an odor. If you are born white, you exude racial superiority. There's nothing you can do about it. As we saw, you can try to be less white, but you're still going to be white, and whiteness is inherently bad. And as a result, you're a racist. You're a white supremacist. You should just accept it. And to combat your racism, you need to do whatever Robin DiAngelo tells you to do. I have one last point here, and it's a little bit facetious, but it's actually what some people believe. Robin DiAngelo is a white woman who has made a fortune talking about racism. Isn't that kind of inherently racist? Why are libraries and individuals promoting Robin DiAngelo instead of someone who's, actually black or a minority? You think I'm joking, but people actually believe this. That same line of reasoning was brought up when this library promoted white fragility. Someone got kind of upset that it was promoting a white book about racism and not a black book. And this just goes to show you that even if you're Robin DiAngelo, as long as you're white, the only correct thing you can really do is keep quiet. And that's basically all I wanted to say in this video. It's not a good book, you should not read White Fragility, but if you really want to, then go ahead, I won't stop you. But I think you could use your time in much better ways. Be sure to subscribe, leave a like, and let me know what you think about this book. Has your opinion on it changed if you've made it this far in the video? As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.